You are looking at one of the most advanced passenger locomotives in Britain. It is powerful, fast, barely a year old, and named after an English river. The Southern Railway is proud of it. The engineering department considers it the future of commuter travel south of London. And within months, every single engine of this class will be ripped from service, banned outright, and never permitted to run in its original form again. The reason is not sabotage. It is not a broken part or a driver's mistake. It is a flaw built into the physics of the locomotive itself, present in every engine of the class from the day it left the workshop. On one ordinary summer evening outside Sevenoaks in Kent, one of these machines tears itself apart at full speed, killing 13 people and injuring dozens more. What the Southern Railway does next is almost without precedent. They ground the entire class overnight. Not speed restricted, not sent for modification, pulled from traffic completely. This is the locomotive that was banned after just one disaster. The Southern Railway came into existence on the 1st of January 1923, the product of the Railways Act that merged Britain's many smaller railway companies into 4 large regional groups. The Southern was stitched together from 3 predecessor companies: the London and South Western Railway, the London Brighton and South Coast Railway, and the South Eastern and Chatham Railway. Each brought its own locomotive workshops, its own design traditions, its own fleet of aging engines, and its own firmly held opinions about how things ought to be done. The merger created a single railway on paper. It did not create a single engineering culture. The locomotive situation was particularly dire. The South Eastern and Chatham had spent the war years running engines into the ground on military traffic and had barely maintained them since. The London Brighton and South Coast had a collection of elegant but small engines designed for an earlier era. The London and South Western had some capable machines, but not nearly enough of them, and nothing that could handle the traffic growth the new company was already projecting. Across the entire combined fleet, there was no single class of locomotive that could serve as a standard for the new railway. Everything needed rethinking. The new company's traffic was dominated by passengers. The vast commuter flows in and out of London's southern terminals, Waterloo, Victoria, Charing Cross, and London Bridge, drove the timetable and defined the railway's identity. The Southern moved more passengers per mile of track than any other railway in Britain, and it did so with a locomotive fleet that was, by the mid-1920s, increasingly inadequate for the job. The chief mechanical engineer responsible for solving this was Richard Maunsell, a quiet, methodical Irishman who had spent his career on the South Eastern and Chatham Railway learning to build reliable machines on tight budgets. Maunsell was not a showman. He did not chase speed records or build exhibition locomotives. He understood the Southern Railway's network in practical terms: dense suburban services, frequent stops, routes where turntables were too short or missing entirely, and timetables that left no room for engines that needed to be turned at the end of every run. What the railway needed was a locomotive fast enough for express schedules, strong enough for heavy commuter trains, and compact enough to run nose or tail without delay. The solution, or what looked like one, was the express tank engine. A tank engine carries its own water supply directly on its frame, stored in tanks alongside or above the boiler, rather than hauling it in a separate tender vehicle coupled behind. This makes the locomotive shorter, lighter, and perfectly capable of running in either direction without needing a turntable. For decades, tank engines had been the reliable workhorses of suburban railways across Britain, handling short-distance stopping services where their compactness and versatility mattered more than raw speed. But Maunsell's ambition went beyond suburban work. The Southern Railway did not just need engines for slow stopping services. It needed engines that could haul express passenger trains at sustained speed on mainline routes south of London. The question was whether a tank engine, a type traditionally built for modest duties, could safely do the job of a much larger tender locomotive. The machines that emerged from the Southern Railway's workshops carried the names of English rivers and quickly became known as the River class. They were built on the 2-6 four-wheel arrangement, a leading pony truck for guidance, 6 large coupled driving wheels for power, and a 4-wheeled trailing bogie designed to support the weight of the substantial water tanks mounted at the rear. They had the boiler capacity and tractive effort to match many tender engines of the same era, combined with the operational flexibility that the Southern Railway's routes demanded. On paper, the River class was an elegant answer to a difficult problem. A locomotive that combined express power with suburban versatility. The Southern Railway put them to work on some of its busiest routes, including the demanding main line through Kent toward the Channel ports. The engineering department was confident. The operational managers were pleased. Nobody was thinking about what might happen when hundreds of gallons of water, carried on the locomotive's own frame, began to shift at high speed. Every locomotive oscillates at speed. The interaction between wheel flanges and railheads, the compression and release of springs, the 1,000 small vibrations of a heavy machine moving at pace, all produce a degree of lateral movement that competent engineering keeps within safe limits. It is normal. It is expected. And in most locomotive designs, it is controlled. But a tank engine running at express speeds carries a burden that a tender engine does not. The water itself. Hundreds of gallons of it, stored in tanks bolted directly to the locomotive's frame. At low speeds, the water sits relatively still. As velocity increases, the water begins to surge. It pushes forward under braking, rocks sideways through curves, and shifts its mass in ways that are difficult to predict and nearly impossible to fully constrain. In a tender locomotive, the water rides in a separate vehicle behind the engine, and its movement is dampened by the coupling and the distance from the driving wheels. In a tank engine, the water sits directly over or beside the drivers. Every surge feeds straight into the locomotive's center of gravity. The effect is compounded by the geometry of the locomotive itself. A tank engine's center of gravity sits higher than a tender engine's, because the water is carried on top of or alongside the boiler, rather than low in a trailing vehicle. As the water surges, that already elevated center of gravity shifts unpredictably, and the locomotive's response to track irregularities changes from moment to moment. The result is a phenomenon that railway engineers call hunting, a lateral oscillation, a rhythmic side-to-side rocking that, once it starts, can amplify with each cycle. At a critical speed, the oscillation becomes self-reinforcing. The locomotive rolls from rail to rail with mounting violence, the wheel flanges slamming against the inner faces of the track, and if the amplitude exceeds what the rail gauge can contain, the wheels climb the railhead and the engine derails. There is no warning. There is no gradual build-up that a skilled driver can sense and correct. The transition from normal running to catastrophic instability happens in seconds. This was the danger waiting inside every River-class locomotive from the moment it left the workshop. The River class entered traffic with the confidence of a railway that believed it had solved a hard engineering problem. The locomotives ran well on suburban and semi-fast services. They rode smoothly at moderate speeds. Footplate crews found them responsive and powerful, capable of keeping time with heavy loads on routes where older engines struggled. For the first months of their operational lives, the River class appeared to be exactly what the Southern Railway had ordered. But the warnings came, and they came in a form the railway could not ignore. In March 1927, a River-class engine derailed at Wrotham, on the main line through Kent. The engine left the track at speed. There were no fatalities, and the railway treated it as an incident rather than a signal. The locomotive was examined, the track was inspected, and the class remained in full service. Then in August 1927, another River class derailed near Maidstone, again on the Kent main line, again at speed. The pattern was the same. Sudden lateral instability, wheels climbing the rails, a locomotive that had been running normally moments before, suddenly tearing itself off the track. Once more, no one was killed. Once more, the railway investigated but did not ground the fleet. The engines were new, they were expensive, and the Southern Railway needed them. Pulling the entire class from service on the basis of 2 non-fatal derailments would have thrown the Kent timetable into chaos. And then, just 4 days before the catastrophe at Sevenoaks, a 3rd River-class engine derailed at Bearsted, only a few miles from the Maidstone incident. 3 derailments of the same class, on the same route corridor, in a matter of months. Each one produced formal reports. Each one pointed to the same troubling riding characteristics. The engineering department had evidence. What it did not have, or did not exercise, was the institutional will to act on that evidence before someone died. The train that departed London for the towns of Kent on the evening of the 24th of August, 1927, was an ordinary commuter service. Every compartment was occupied by passengers settling in for the journey south. The locomotive was one of the River-class engines, coupled to a standard rake of passenger coaches. The driver was experienced. The fireman had the boiler in good order. Nothing about the departure was unusual in any respect. The route south from London climbed through the suburban sprawl, threaded through the junction at Orpington, and headed into the greener country of northwest Kent. By the time the train approached Sevenoaks, it was running at speed on a stretch of line that presented no obvious hazard. The track through this section ran through a cutting, with a road bridge spanning the gap overhead. Trains passed beneath it dozens of times a day without incident, without comment, without anyone giving it a second thought. The driver felt the first signs of lateral movement somewhere before the cutting. The locomotive began to rock, a side-to-side motion that built from barely perceptible to deeply alarming in the space of a few heartbeats. The driving wheels hammered against the rails with increasing force. The frame shuddered. The suspension, designed to absorb normal track irregularities, was overwhelmed by forces it was never built to handle. Within seconds, the hunting oscillation exceeded the tolerance of the rail gauge. The locomotive's wheels climbed the railhead, and the engine lurched off the track at full express speed. The cab struck the bridge that spanned the cutting, and the locomotive was flung onto its side, dragging the leading coaches with it. The coaches behind, still carrying their full momentum, slammed into the wreckage ahead. Carriages telescoped and overturned, glass shattered, timber splintered. The noise was heard half a mile away in the town. When the movement stopped, the scene in the cutting was devastating. The locomotive lay on its side, its water tanks ruptured, water streaming into the debris. The front coaches were crushed and scattered across the cutting floor. 13 people were dead. Dozens more were trapped in wreckage, some with injuries they would carry for the rest of their lives. Rescue workers arriving from Sevenoaks found a disaster that looked less like a railway derailment and more like something dropped from a great height. Pause 1 second. The news reached London within the hour. By morning, every major newspaper carried the story on its front page. The photographs showed twisted metalwork, shattered coaches, rescue workers picking through wreckage that barely resembled a train. For a public that regarded the railways as the safest form of transport in the country, the images from Sevenoaks were profoundly unsettling. The Southern Railway's response came fast and went further than anyone expected. Before the official Board of Trade inquiry had opened, before the inspectors had finished examining the wreck site, the railway ordered every River-class locomotive removed from traffic. Every single one. Not the engine involved in the crash, not the engines assigned to that particular route. The entire class, pulled from duties across the network and shunted into sidings and workshops where they would sit, cold and unused, while the inquiry ran its course. This was not an act of routine caution. It was an act of recognition. The Southern Railway's own engineers understood, probably within hours of the crash, that the problem was not confined to a single locomotive or a single section of track. It was systemic. The design itself was the hazard. Every river-class engine carried the same physics, the same potential for catastrophic instability at speed. The railway could not predict which engine might derail next, or on which service, or how many passengers would be aboard when it happened. The only way to eliminate the risk entirely was to eliminate the class from service. In the history of British railways, the wholesale withdrawal of an entire locomotive class after a single fatal accident was nearly unheard of. The 3 prior derailments had been survivable. Sevenoaks was not. That the Southern Railway acted within days, voluntarily before anyone ordered them to, spoke volumes about how clearly the engineering department understood what had happened in that cutting. The Board of Trade inquiry into the Sevenoaks disaster was led by a senior inspecting officer from the Ministry of Transport. His task was to answer a question that was simple to state and enormously difficult to resolve. Why had a modern, well-maintained locomotive, running on soundtrack in fair weather, destroyed itself and killed 13 people with no external cause? The investigation was exhaustive. The track through the Sevenoaks cutting was surveyed in minute detail, every rail joint measured, every sleeper examined, every chair and fishplate inspected for defect. The Permanent Way Department's maintenance records were reviewed. The locomotive's own history was scrutinized. When it was built, when it was last overhauled, what components had been replaced, what condition the springs and axle boxes were in. Survivors described the final seconds before the crash. Railway staff who had seen the train pass through stations along the route testified about its speed and behavior. Footplate crews from other River Class 264 tank engines were asked whether they had ever experienced anything similar. The physical evidence pointed in one direction. The track was in good condition. The driver had not exceeded the permitted speed. There was no broken component, no cracked axle, no fractured tire, no wheel defect. The locomotive had not struck anything on the line. It had simply oscillated beyond the limits of the track's ability to hold it. The inquiry's conclusion was unambiguous. The River Class 264 tank locomotives suffered from an inherent lateral instability at express speeds. The combination of heavy water tanks mounted on the locomotive frame, a high center of gravity that shifted as the water moved, and the dynamic characteristics of the 264 wheel arrangement created conditions in which hunting oscillation could develop rapidly, unpredictably, and with catastrophic consequences. The problem was not a manufacturing defect. It was not a maintenance failure. It was a feature of the design itself, present in every locomotive of the class. The inspecting officer's recommendations were direct. The River Class should not return to service in their existing form. If the Southern Railway wished to salvage the engines, they would need to be rebuilt as tender locomotives, removing the water tanks from the frame and eliminating the root cause of the instability. The Southern Railway, which had already reached the same conclusion before the report was published, was making plans to do exactly that. The Sevenoaks disaster sent shockwaves through the British railway industry. Across the country, other companies had been experimenting with large 264 tank engines for express and semi-express duties, drawn by the same operational advantages that had attracted the Southern Railway. The London Midland and Scottish Railway had built its own substantial fleet. Reports of rough riding at speed had circulated among footplate crews, but as on the Southern, concerns from the men on the footplate had not translated into restrictions from the engineering department. Sevenoaks changed that calculation overnight. The London Midland and Scottish Railway reportedly imposed speed restrictions on its own 264 tank engines, though the details of how far and how fast those restrictions went are not entirely clear from available records. The Great Western Railway, which had been considering similar designs for its own services, quietly set aside those plans. Locomotive superintendents across the country re-examined the riding characteristics of every large tank engine in their fleets. The engineering press, which had praised the concept of the express tank engine only months earlier, now published sober analyses of the forces involved. Other companies shelved their plans for similar types. The idea that a tank engine could safely do the work of a tender engine at the highest speeds, an idea that had seemed not just plausible but clever barely 2 years earlier, was finished as a serious engineering proposition in Britain. The lesson was as stark as a derailed locomotive lying in a cutting. There are hard physical limits to what certain configurations can safely do, and the penalty for exceeding those limits is not a gradual decline in performance. It is sudden, total, and irreversible. The margin between safe running and catastrophe can be invisible right up to the moment it vanishes. Pause for 1 second. The Southern Railway did not scrap the River class. Destroying nearly new locomotives would have compounded a human tragedy with a financial catastrophe. Instead, Maunsell and his engineering team devised what amounted to a complete transformation. Every River-class locomotive would be rebuilt from a tank engine into a tender engine. The conversion was radical. The side tanks and rear bunker were stripped from each locomotive's frame. The four-wheeled trailing bogie that had supported the heavy rear water supply was replaced. A conventional tender, carrying the water and coal in a separate vehicle, was coupled behind each engine. The wheel arrangement changed from 264 tank to 260, a proven, inherently stable configuration that kept the weight of the water well behind the driving wheels and entirely separate from the engine's own springing and balance. The rebuilt locomotives bore little resemblance to the machines that had carried river names. The sleek, self-contained profile of the tank engine was gone, replaced by the longer, more conventional outline of a tender locomotive. The river names themselves were removed. What emerged from the workshops were workmanlike engines, competent and unremarkable, the opposite of the ambitious design that had preceded them. But they worked. The instability vanished. The rebuilt engines ran without incident for decades, first on the Southern Railway and later under British Railways after nationalisation in 1948. They hauled secondary passenger trains, freight services and local duties across southern England, performing reliably and safely on the kinds of routes that the original design had been intended to serve, just without the dangerous ambition of doing it at express speed in tank form. The rebuild was a practical triumph. It was also a quiet concession. The entire premise of the River class, the belief that a tank engine could match a tender engine at the highest speeds, had been wrong. The rebuild did not improve the design. It surrendered it. Pause for 1 second. 13 people boarded an ordinary commuter train on an ordinary summer evening and did not come home. They had no reason to suspect danger. There was nothing unusual about the service, nothing irregular about the locomotive, nothing in the weather or the timetable or the condition of the track that would have given anyone pause. They trusted the railway the way millions of people trusted it every day, as a safe and reliable way to get from the city to their front door. They died because a locomotive type carried a design flaw that its builders had not fully reckoned with, and its operators had failed to act upon despite mounting evidence. 3 separate derailments of the same class in the months before Sevenoaks had produced formal incident reports. The physics of lateral instability in high-speed tank engines were discussed in engineering literature of the period. The knowledge existed. The warnings existed. What did not exist was the institutional urgency to ground a fleet of expensive new locomotives on the basis of incidents that had, so far, not killed anyone. This is a pattern that recurs throughout the history of railways and throughout the history of engineering more broadly. The gap between what is known and what is acted upon. The distance between a formal incident report and a funded modification on the workshop floor. The quiet assumption that because something has not yet killed, it will not kill. At Sevenoaks, that gap was measured in 13 lives lost on a summer evening in Kent. The Southern Railway acted with speed and clarity after the crash. Withdrawing an entire class within days of the fatal accident was extraordinary. But the swiftness of the response cannot change what the response was: reactive. The flaw had been present from the beginning. The derailments had been happening for months. The crash was not a freak occurrence. It was an inevitability that arrived on a particular evening, at a particular speed, beneath a particular bridge. The Sevenoaks disaster marked the effective end of the large express tank engine in Britain. After 1927, no major British railway company seriously proposed building tank locomotives for high-speed mainline passenger work. The 2-6 four-wheel arrangement survived in service for decades on suburban and secondary duties, but always under speed restrictions, always on less demanding routes, always operating within limits that Sevenoaks had defined in the starkest possible terms. The rebuilt River-class engines served quietly for years. They hauled freight and local passenger services across the Southern Railways network, and later across the southern region of British Railways, performing without drama and without recognition. The River names were gone. The engineering ambition was gone. What remained were ordinary tender engines that did exactly what was required of them, no more and no less. In the longer view of locomotive history, the River class holds a particular and uncomfortable position. It is not remembered for what it accomplished. It is remembered for what it proved, that the distance between a clever idea and a safe machine can be measured in human lives, and that the physics of a moving locomotive do not care how elegant the concept looks on paper. The 264 tank type itself was not finished forever. Designers in later decades found ways to make it work safely at moderate speeds, with better springing, lower centers of gravity, and strict operational limits. But the dream of the express tank engine, the machine that could do everything a tender locomotive could do while being shorter, lighter, and more flexible, died at Sevenoaks. No one seriously tried to revive it. The cutting at Sevenoaks still carries trains today. Thousands of commuters pass through it every week on modern electric services, traveling the same stretch of track at speeds the River class never reached, held safely on the rails by engineering that has absorbed a century of hard lessons. Most of them will never know what happened here. If this is the kind of railway history you want more of, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Every modern railway safety standard for locomotive stability testing carries within it, among many other hard lessons, the echo of what happened in a Kent cutting on a summer evening in 1927.